The ship once again emerged from the warp, and every survivor tried to pull themselves together. With the death of the creator, the creation also fevered. The wanderer would suddenly plunge into the warp and just as suddenly emerge from it. Then it would convulse under the impact of shells, but relentlessly cling to life. In the past, one could calmly walk through all the decks to the captain's bridge, but now every step had to be fought for, as the metal and stone-made corridors of the labyrinths ceased to be safe and became inhabited by mutants whose population was rapidly growing. After some time, he reached a place known as the Temple of Knowledge, but did not enter immediately, for there were two inside. The first stood by Lord Malik's writing desk, and the second examined the altar. The strangers spoke about some numbers and reunification with the Primarch, and then they left. He slipped into the temple, but the master was not there. Days ago, he would not have set foot here even under the threat of death. But now his mind teetered on the brink of madness. The memories of unfathomable horrors and pain, as well as the sensation of flesh undergoing changes, were still fresh. Orvac extended his hand to the table and saw microscopic mouths and eyes on his skin. Why? He asked himself. But a sudden, clear and distinct voice snapped him out of his mental stupor. Read! He opened the first scroll that had fallen from the shelf and began to read. After the horrifying civil war, which remained in history under the name Horus Heresy, Primarch Roboute Guilliman created the sacred Codex of War Conduct and named it the Codex Astartes. According to this tome, all Primarchs were to divide their own legions into chapters of 1,000 Space Marines, with 10 companies in each. He came to this decision to ensure that no leader possessed the power of an entire legion, thus preventing a repeat of those dreadful events. Rogaldorn opposed such an initiative. He insisted that after the Horus Heresy, the legions needed unity more than ever and should remain united to protect humanity from the remnants of the traitorous legions. However, he changed his decision after an event known as the Iron Cage, in which the Imperial Fists lost about 400 Space Marines, with each survivor receiving at least one injury. Dorn conceded to Guilliman's demands and divided the Legion into 3 chapters. The unyielding followers of the Primarch retained the name and colours of the Imperial Fists, while the more zealous brothers became the Black Templars. The 3rd chapter consisted of the newly initiated and the most balanced ones, who received the name Crimson Fists, and their chapter master was Alexis Pollux, who would serve in this position for a full 800 years, during which he would develop battle doctrines and his own vision of the Codex Astartes. What? Orvac said wearily. What civil war? How could Astartes betray the Imperium? They are perfect warriors. But how could he, a simple officer of the IcePo, know the history of the Imperium, especially now that he could be considered a mutant, heretic and an apostate? His emotions created a faint ripple in the warp, like a pebble thrown into water, and a creature appeared on the lower deck, noticing these waves. He continued. When the Crimson Fist chapter was formed, Primarch Dorn provided the chapter master with reinforcements from recently inducted combatants. Thus, Alexis Pollux was able to effectively introduce the teachings and new traditions of the Codex Astartes into young minds. The chapter adheres to the Codex and rarely deviates from it. Their preparation allows them to effectively counter opponents who utilize entirely different tactical approaches to battle. Thus, the Crimson Fists quickly adapt their tactics to overcome anyone who opposes the will of the Imperium. Most often, the chapter operated in the Loki sector, and, as it happened, battles with orcs frequently occurred here. Over time, they became true experts in countering this aggressive Xenos species. This played a crucial role, as the green-skinned combat squads often received reinforcements and were supplied with ammunition. The Adeptus Administratum and the Ordo Xenos frequently turned to the Crimson Fists for help when significant orc forces were gathering across the Imperium. The Crimson Fists remained experts in defensive actions, like their progenitors. The chapter maintained the tradition of allowing one warrior to bear the heraldry and status of the Emperor's champion before entering a major conflict, but this practice was seldom used. Similarly, The Crimson Fists are one of the 12 chapters that participate in the Feast of Blades alongside the Imperial Fists. They have never hesitated to demonstrate their loyalty to the Imperium and embody it in their battle cry. "There is only the Emperor, he is our shield and protector." Had such skillful warriors been on my home planet, things might have been different, Orvac said with a sigh. Instead, a flawless host had descended upon Sendenis, followed by the Carcharodons. What a pity. The answer to his musings came as a terrifying laugh from a dozen throats in the distant corridors. He looked fearfully into the pitch darkness of the doorway and removed from his shoulder a rusty but still usable laser gun. "Do not be afraid," whispered the already familiar voice somewhere on the edge of his consciousness. "Continue reading." "Who are you?" Orvac whispered, barely audibly, and looked somewhere up. "Consider me your protector. Read further." The Crimson Fists paint their power armor in dark blue with crimson trims and white markings. When a neophyte joins the ranks of the chapter, his left gauntlet is painted crimson. This is a tribute to a long-standing tradition of cutting the palms of recruits to forge a strong bond. When a warrior reaches veteran status, the right gauntlet is also painted crimson. Lieutenants mark a red stripe down the center of their helmets, and scouts are distinguished by 2 red gauntlets with blue shields on their arms. The chapter's symbol is a left gauntlet raised and clenched into a fist. This symbolizes the strength and determination of the Crimson Fists, as well as their defiance against heretics and traitors. The emblem originates from the symbol of the Imperial Fists and was painted red in honor of the first chapter master, Alexis Pollux. The Crimson Fists often responded to the calls of the Inquisition and the Adeptus Administratum. Gradually, a bond so strong was forged between the chapter and these organizations that they were even tasked with assaults against their brothers from other chapters. 3 such instances have been recorded. The first was the destruction of the sons of Gideon, as the chapter had descended into madness and heresy. The second were the Marines Vigilant, who fell under the influence of an unknown Xenos phenomenon that extinguished their will to fight. The Marines Vigilant offered no resistance when the fleet of the Crimson Fists turned their home world into a wasteland by order of the High Lords. The third chapter the Crimson Fists fought against were the Soul Drinkers. At the end of the 41st millennium, they were declared renegades. On Enthymien 4, an entire company of the Crimson Fists attempted to annihilate the remaining Soul Drinkers, but they outwitted their executioners and managed to escape from the planet. The Fists succeeded in thwarting a budding Dark Eldar conspiracy, but the fact that their primary target eluded them saddened them. Their readiness to punish their brethren earned the Crimson Fists the reputation of terror's attack dogs in the eyes of more freedom-loving chapters, such as the Space Wolves, White Scars, and Exorcists. The mortals still felt oppressive disappointment at the thought that such perfect warriors could betray the Imperium. Somewhere in the depths of the void ship prowled an apex predator, which had sensed the disturbances in the warp and adjusted its course towards its target. Its menacing steps echoed through the corridors, causing the population to hide in burrows. For the first 9 millennia, the Crimson Fists were fleet-based, with their monastery fortress being the flagship Rutilus Tyrannus. They partook in the scourging at Uralic Prime in the 31st millennium. The colonists were assaulted by several tribes of Eldar Exodites, who attacked repeatedly with astonishing ferocity. The Xenos were determined to annihilate every last human. The Crimson Fists were equally determined to stop them. In the early stages of the conflict, Alexis Pollux heavily relied on his orbital superiority, devastating vast areas of lush forests where the Exodites were hiding. Once his enemies were forced into the open, Pollux launched a series of attacks that shattered the Elder squads. The surviving Xenos broke through to defensive lines and faced the overwhelming firepower of the Crimson Fist's devastators and battle tanks. Though the losses among the Space Marines were considerable, the Eldar were completely routed, and the colony on Uralic Prime was liberated. From the year 544 to 546 of the 32nd millennium, The Crimson Fist participated in the War of the Beast. In the mid-32 end millennium, the Imperium faced the threat of the largest Orc invasion. The Imperial Fists fought against the colossal armies of the Beast and were nearly annihilated. The last surviving captain, Kurland, activated the Last Wall Protocol, summoning the successor chapters to reunite. The Crimson Fists joined the Black Templars and other chapters when the Orcs attacked Luna. The Greenskins' onslaught was halted, and after the successful defense of Terra, the Fists joined the crusade to Ullanor, where the Beast had made its lair. The Beast killed many, but was himself felled by the hand of the Primarch Vulcan. Despite the death of their leader, the Orcs continued to fight for several more Terran years. Captain Kurland was killed. Consequently, along with him perished the Imperial Fists chapter. Ultimately, the Crimson Fists and several successor chapters sacrificed part of their strength to rebuild the parent chapter. One of the most famous campaigns of the Crimson Fists was the Crusade of Righteous Liberation, waged over 300 Terran years in the 36th millennium. This period went down in history as the Age of Apostasy. The Imperium was engulfed in internal strife due to a massive schism within the Adeptus Ministorum. After the defeat of Gog Vandir, the Crimson Fists chapter undertook the task of reclaiming control over lost Imperial worlds. The fleet broke through warp storms to planets that had fallen into anarchy or had been seized by Xenos. The first was the world of Velta, whose population suffered under the yoke of the Orc war boss, Gara Nazgar. 4 companies of the Crimson Fists descended upon Velta, while the rest of the fleet returned to the warp to find other afflicted worlds. Led by the valiant Captain Sandrias, the Crimson Fists struck at Gara Nazgar like a storm in azure armor. They assaulted the munitions mines, burned the factories, and gunned down the convoys carrying food and weapons through the dusty wastelands. The Orcs were scattered across different parts of the world, trying to protect the surviving facilities. It was then that Captain Sandrias regrouped his forces and attacked Nazgar's fortress in the ruins of what had once been the world's capital. The warboss could do nothing as the mighty Astartes inexorably advanced through the devastated city. Nazgar led the last counterattack, but he and his team of nobs were annihilated by the concentrated fire of the Crimson Fists. After the death of warboss Nazgar, the Fists left Velt, and the remnants of the Greenskins were successfully finished off by the liberated local inhabitants. Velta was merely the first of 84 worlds reclaimed in the Lona Imperium. Over 300 Terran years of the Crusade, the chapter's numbers dwindled due to battle losses. They were unable to recruit neophytes to replace the fallen. Finally, after breaking through the 4-century siege of Barental by rebels on Excel CV2, Magister Kordoff announced the conclusion of the campaign. By the end of the Crusade of Righteous Liberation, only 128 Space Marines survived. They were consolidated into one company, and then efforts were made to replenish the losses. Since then, the first company has been called the Crusader Company, and it always consists of 128 warriors. Furthermore, it is considered a bad omen to go to war without the first company. The culture of the chapter underwent radical changes. After the grueling 300-year crusade, the Crimson Fists abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and settled on Rin's world, a planet that would thereafter be considered their home world. It was curious, Orvac shed a sparse tear. After so many years of suffering, they were granted such an opportunity. And his emotions once again resonated with the irritating laughter from the corridor, but now it was closer. Orvac could not bear it any longer, and thrusting his lasgun forward, began to slowly approach the doorway. "Do not approach!" The same whisper echoed in his head. In the next moment, he saw a barely perceptible white haze where the boundary of the Temple of Knowledge ended. With each passing second, it became more distinct, and beyond it, Orvac saw crowds of humanoid beings. Their skin hung loosely from their bones, open mouths snapping threateningly, and sparse strands of hair dangled from their skulls. Their eyes glowed with an unhealthy yellow-green light. They spewed toxic sludge, which sizzled as it evaporated upon hitting the pallid veil. The minuscule fragments of knowledge Adram Aliak had shared with Orvac surfaced in his mind. Demons! he uttered in horror. "Do you see?" The mysterious voice returned once more. "Your master is dead, but his wards still operate. Continue, finish his work." Rin's world was an enticing agri-world, supplying exotic foodstuffs to the imperial nobility throughout the sector and beyond. The Crimson Fists had built their fortress monastery in the inhospitable Hellblade Mountains, and while they retained their feudal rights over the world, they still allowed the hereditary position of governor to remain in the hands of the local nobility. This was entirely in line with Rogal Dawn's approach to planets from which the Imperial Fists and Crimson Fists recruited, allowing the chapter to focus on their own duties while the planetary administration attended to its own affairs. The proximity of the world of Rin to the primary recruitment source, and the chapter, the feral world of Blackwater, made it ideal. This allowed the apothecaries and chaplains of the Crimson Fists to attend the annual Bloodfist Festival, during which the bravest of the young men would compete for the right to join the mighty warriors from the stars. During the festival, candidates had to undergo trials of strength and bravery. The culmination was the Dragon Rite, where a potential space marine had to seek out and kill one of the ferocious, spiked swamp dragons, doing so with nothing but their bare hands. Each year, only a handful of young men would reach this rite during the festival, and only one or two would survive to the end. This practice ensured the recruitment of the very best representatives of the planet's population into the chapter. This festival is far from the only tradition of the Crimson Fists. For example, they celebrate Founding Day of the chapter. To mark this day, all available members of the chapter gather in the fortress monastery, while those on missions far from the world of Rin conduct private ceremonies. Excerpts from the works of Alexis Pollux and Rogal Dawn are read aloud to those assembled, followed by individual members recounting stories from the past and recent events. This reminds the brothers of the labours of their ancestors and how they still apply them today. Such critical self-examination is encouraged by the Codex Astartes, but practiced by very few, for the pride of the Fists obstructs the acknowledgement that ancestors could be mistaken or that there are lessons to be learned from their errors. During the celebration of Founding Day, chaplains conduct a ritual known as the Miracle of Blood. A group of 20 chaplains, collectively known as the Sacrasium, transforms a small portion of Rogal Dawn's dried blood into liquid before the eyes of the observers. This serves as a symbolic reminder that the lost Primarch is still spiritually with them. The Crimson Fists have the custom of collecting orc bones and making them into talismans. The teeth and skulls of Xenos lie in the halls of trophies and are attached to the armour of battle brothers as a reminder of valour in combat. Sometimes the talismans could be bones, skulls, or even fragments of torn enemy banners. The sight of these decorations can enrage a greenskin and prompt aggressive and reckless actions in battle. Unique traditions of the chapter include the training of the librarians, which is kept secret. It is unknown how much they deviate from the Codex Astartes in this regard, but the Psychers of the Crimson Fists possess exceptional abilities, and their hatred of Xenos is projected as tangible energy, causing intense pain to all who are not human. Additionally, the librarian can enhance close combat attacks, helping to crush Xenos in armor or with tough hides. Moreover, they temper their body and spirit, or that of a close ally. Thanks to this skill, a warrior will continue to fight despite mortal wounds and exhaustion, which will ultimately kill him. Orvac once more glanced through the doorway. Beyond the white veil, the unholy throngs were clearly visible, but they no longer clustered around the passage. They parted before the higher predator. The tall black figure approached almost to the barrier and then retreated. Its inner vision captured the cold, animalistic fury of the unborn, who had taken possession of the half-dead bodies, the fear of the pitiful creature crouched over a scroll in the depths of the Temple of Knowledge, and the radiance of warding talismans. But there was something else in the far corner of the corridor. There was something like an improvised sniper's nest, within which lay a petrified body of a space marine. It was terrifying even to think what such a statue could be used for, but it was not a statue. Inside it, There was the same glow as that of the possessed unholy throngs, and a bolter lay nearby. Meanwhile, driven by whispers, Orvac continued to read. In the year 978 of the 39th millennium, the Conclave, the ruler of the craft world of Iyanden, issued an ultimatum to the ruler of the world, Thule. All human inhabitants must leave the planet within a month or be expelled by force. Soon, he decided to flee and abandon his people to their fate. A month later, a large army of Xenos arrived in the system and found the fleet of the Crimson Fists. The Elder attempted to break through the blockade, but suffered extremely heavy losses before they managed to escape the wrath of the Astartes. In the year 876 of the 41st millennium, the Crimson Fists once again encountered the Xenos from this same craft world during an assault on the planet Halabor. Forces of Iyanden sought to annihilate the Planetary Council, for in their souls resided certain seeds of a curse. Unaware that the Eldar were preventing a great heresy, the Crimson Fists landed on the planet and attacked the Xenos. By the time the battle commenced, most of the Eldar had already vanished into the webway, but a small contingent was fated to hold off the vengeful Astartes. The Crimson Fists were led by Captain of the Fourth Company, Alessio Cortez. Despite having his heart pierced by an enemy dagger and numerous other severe injuries, he did not relent and led the final charge against the Xenos until they fully retreated into the webway. In the year 926 of the 41st millennium, a Chaos warband known as the Purge took a strategically critical astropathic relay planet called Vaxhalia. Within a single solar month, the Chaos forces exterminated no fewer than 14 billion citizens. This atrocity did not go unnoticed for long. The Hammer of Dawn, the Fire Lords, and the Crimson Fists initiated a planetary assault supported by 19 battle groups of Cadian regiments and the Imperial Knights of House Raven. Soon, Vaxhalia turned into a seething cauldron of war, attracting forces from across the sector. However, matters worsened when the ship Terminus Est appeared in orbit and discharged hundreds of plague marines onto the planet's surface. Typhus, the Traveller, spearheaded a new offensive, and with each passing day, more and more Cadians fell victim to the zombie plague. Soon, the Astartes and Knights found themselves fighting alone against waves of traitors and walking dead. When the Second Imperial battle fleet arrived, its commander deemed the world irrevocably lost and began preparations to evacuate the survivors and initiate an exterminatus. The next entry once again stirred a pang of disappointment in Orvac, for it spoke of treachery within the ranks of the Crimson Fists. The campaign was titled The Hunt for Haxon the Defiler, 41st Millennium, with the exact years unknown. Hoxan was initially a captain of the Crimson Fists, but turned against the Imperium on the planet Hydra Secundus. The fact is, Inquisitor Reba had ordered the world to be subjected to exterminatus due to alleged heresy and rebellion against humanity, which in reality had never occurred. Reba simply sought to cover up committed crimes. That an Inquisitor could so easily incinerate a world at his whim enraged Captain Haxon. In his rage, he killed the Inquisitor and part of the Crimson Fists company under his command, knowing that they would never go against the Holy Ordos. Ultimately, he lost faith in the Emperor and humanity and joined the Red Corsairs warband, later becoming renowned as the Chaos Lord Haxon the Defiler. For the next 60 Terran years, he raided Imperial worlds, paying particular attention to monastery worlds dedicated to Imperial saints. Through his actions, he sought to undermine the cult of the God Emperor and end the worship of the one who led such a deceitful and unjust political system known as the Imperium of Man. However, he was ultimately trapped by the Crimson Fists, who had long sought to cleanse the stain of dishonor caused by Hoxan's betrayal. The Astartes covertly accompanied the cruiser of Princess Hespera, which carried a high-ranking ecclesiarchal dignitary and 12,000 pilgrims. Hoxan could not resist such a tempting target, and his cruiser, the Scourge of the Unfaithful, was destroyed. The renegade himself was killed in battle by the veteran Sergeant Sandor Goliath. Later, in the same 41st millennium, the Crimson Fists conducted a joint campaign with the Black Templars against the Orc warlord Gitsmot. During the operations, the kin orders grew closer, with the Templars even painting their gauntlets red, and the crimson fists adorning heraldic crosses on their right knees. Such an unusual gesture of unity helped establish a close connection and bolster the resolve of the brave warriors who participated in the successful purification of the system from the filth of the greenskins. In the year 989 of the 41st millennium, trouble crept right to the doorstep of their home world. It all began when the Cagitators intercepted a message in one of the Orc dialects used by several major clans in the Harridan sector. According to the Ordo Xenos classification, these clans are named the Goths, Blood Axes, Death Skulls and Evil Sons. Alongside them, there were 33 smaller clans. The speaker introduced himself as the war boss Urzok Makul. It is known that he was a lieutenant of Snagrod, the self-proclaimed arch-arsonist of Charadon. The message was intended for all Orc groups located in the Segmentum Tempestus and the Segmentum Ultima. According to the content, all skinships in these regions must rally under the banners of the arch-arsonist, for the war of Snagrod had begun, and it could not be stopped, and that this was the will of the Orc gods Gork and Mork. The arch-arsonist of Charadon had united the warring factions and launched a large-scale invasion of the Loki system. Snagrod seized several human colonies with minimal resistance and boasted that his next conquest would be the world of Rin. The first attack targeted the world of Hard Landing, as it was on the path between Charadon and the Rin star system. The third company of the Crimson Fists responded to the call for aid. However, due to faulty reconnaissance, the Space Marines suffered a defeat. They underestimated the strength of Snagrod's forces, and only a few warriors managed to escape and relay information to Pedro Cantor. The chapter master immediately recalled all the Crimson Fists and began organizing the defense of Rin's world. As soon as all the companies had returned, the Orcs appeared in the system. The Fists had no time to plan a counteroffensive, so they employed multi-tiered defensive satellite systems. With their help, waves of Orc cruisers and assault ships were destroyed. Then, tragedy struck. A malfunction occurred and one of the surface-launched missiles failed to exit the atmosphere, crashing directly onto the fortress monastery of the Order. The warhead, designed to breach void shields, detonated, damaging the weapons arsenal. A chain of explosions tore through the fortress and the surrounding defensive structures. Hundreds of Astartes perished. Only those guarding the outer perimeter managed to survive. "So many deaths," whispered Orvac. "I remember how Lord Malik spoke of entities that create situations like this missile incident and then rejoice when everything goes awry. Surely they had a hand in this." Since the fortress monastery was the central command hub for the satellites, the planet's entire defense system was completely disabled, and the Xenos landed on the surface. The resistance was crushed, and the survivors had to stealthily make their way to the surviving squads of the Crimson Fists for 328 hours. When Cantor realized that approximately 400 Astartes had survived, he faced a choice: lead the warriors in a final battle, ensuring the chapter's place in the halls of glory of the Imperium, or attempt to preserve the chapter at all costs. He chose the latter, and the Fists focused on defending the city of New Rin. Through the strategic genius of Pedro Cantor and the heroic sacrifices of dozens of Crimson Fists, the Imperium achieved victory. Wave after wave of Orcs crashed upon their positions, but the Space Marines stood unyielding, and countless green-skinned foes fell under the fire of bolters. The chapter master had encountered Snagrod face-to-face several times, but their final battle took place on the roof of the Nalpheus terminal, the starport of New Rin. Snagrod leapt out of a helicopter and landed so heavily that Cantor felt as if the platform beneath their feet trembled. Unlike other war bosses, Snagrod did not don power armor. His massive muscular torso bore nothing but deep scars and burns, bulging muscles and veins as thick as a human finger. This absence of armor was the most striking display of confidence and strength that Cantor had ever seen. Snagrod also lacked a power claw. Of all the weapons he could choose, he opted for a heavy stubber with a perfectly fitted bayonet, now held in his right hand. A melee weapon was strapped to his back, but Cantor had not yet had the chance to observe it. The Xenos pointed the stubber directly at Cantor and pulled the trigger. The chapter master, in turn, raised Dawn's arrow and fired a split second later. Ammunition flew in both directions and hit their targets. Cantor activated his Narthesium in time, and the Orc's bullet ricocheted off the energy field, glinting in the air. Bolts and Dawn's arrows met their mark, but Snagrod was unharmed. It seemed as though he too was shielded by some semblance of a barrier, explaining why he did not need cumbersome metal armor. The bolter rounds turned into harmless green flashes. Pedro knew he couldn't activate the Narthesium again without overloading the system, possibly causing an explosion. Discarding the stubber, the monster charged into close combat. The distance between the Orc's legs and Cantor closed in mere seconds. The chapter master let out a battle cry and prepared to meet his opponent, revving his chainsword and powering up the power fist on his right hand. Snagrod drew 2 giant chain axes, painted in a black and white checkered pattern from his broad back. The enemies clashed in the center of the Nalphaeus platform. Cantor dodged a crushing blow and slashed at the enemy's gut with his sword. The creature's energy shield was still active, but the source of its power remained unknown. The energy seemed to emanate from Snagrod's body, but there was no time to investigate. Another swing of the axe nearly cost the chapter master his head, the weapon missing by a hair's breadth. Cantor tried to stay close. Snagrod's next strike provided an opening, and the chapter master delivered a blow with his power fist, capable of destroying almost any living being. Yet the power was absorbed by the shield, and the Orc leader did not flinch. Cantor's adrenaline levels surged even higher. He felt like a child unable to harm his opponent. Distracted by the deadly motion of the axes, Snagrod managed to kick him. The blow struck his midsection, sending the Space Marine flying 10 meters and dragging him across the surface of the landing pad. Snagrod rushed forward while the chapter master lay on the ground. The creature simultaneously raised both chain axes and put all its strength into one powerful strike. Cantor rolled away and the axes slashed through the air. Their teeth howled in frustration as they bit into the rockrit. The Xenos roared and wrenched the axes free while Pedro sprang to his feet and moved around the monster. Attached to the Orc's belt on its back, an unusual device was discovered. The chapter master thrust his blade into it. Energy shields delayed objects moving at high speed, but allowed slower ones through. This device was just that. The tip of the sword passed through the energy shield. There was a click, and the shield deactivated. The Orc felt it, turned around, and struck Cantor in the side with one of the axes. The blow sent the chapter master flying once again. The right pauldron cracked, and fragments of ceramite sprayed in all directions. But Pedro had achieved more than he had hoped. Now the leader was vulnerable, and all his fury and thirst for vengeance flared anew, sweeping away his self-control in a torrent of molten lava. He immediately sprang up, his consciousness receding, giving way to primal, uncontrolled rage. With a war cry that echoed across the platform, the chapter master once again charged at the Orc. Nothing held him back. The killer instinct overcame all barriers. Snagrod also roared and rushed to meet him. They clashed like 2 avalanches, ceramite armor against hides tougher and thicker than old tanned leather. The axes tore through the air, their engines howling greedily once more, thirsting for blood. Snagrod tried to slice Cantor in half, but only pierced empty space. The chapter master ducked under the blow and finally reached his opponent. His sword plunged deep into the monster's side and twisted within the body. Snagrod howled in pain and fury, tried to shove Cantor away, but the pain slowed his movements, and the Space Marine easily evaded the creature's grasp. He pulled the sword out, and hot blood gushed out. Snagrod struck again, but staggered, his legs entirely covered in blood. The chapter master pursued the Orc relentlessly, constantly attacking. He swung his power fist, aiming for Snagrod's head, but the creature recoiled, stopping the blow with a massive shoulder. The thick deltoid muscle tore with a nightmarish sound, exposing bones and tendons. Snagrod wavered and fell to one knee. Cantor kicked him, toppling him to the ground, and raised his hand to strike the broad chest. Snagrod intercepted the power fist, gripping the chapter master's wrist with an iron grip. Pedro's reaction was immediate. Thrusting his left hand forward, still clutching his blade, he aimed the weapon at the monster's throat. Snagrod's left shoulder was almost useless, but despite the pain, the orc managed to block with his right hand and caught the blade with his bare paw. With a scream, he tore the sword from Cantor's grasp. The blade clanged as it hit the ground, skidding far from the combatants. Pedro roared and began to pummel the monster's head with his fist. Not the power fist, but a ceramite gauntlet, and that was enough. The fury of his blows was monstrous. He struck and struck the creature in the face, shattering its teeth, leaving deep bloody wounds on its cheeks and forehead, blinding it in one eye and breaking its massive jaw. Snagrod tried to defend himself, but lying on his back he could barely hold back the unstoppable fury of the Space Marine with one hand while still clutching the Chapter Master's power fist with the other. Twisting his body, the orc threw the Master off. Springing to his feet, the Master prepared for another attack, but Snagrod did not hesitate. He dashed towards the helicopter, hovering over the edge of the platform. Cantor gave chase, but suddenly the autocannon roared, forcing him to recoil to avoid being torn to shreds. Snagrod did not slow down. Blood gushed from his wounds, leaving wide red streaks on the ground. The helicopter moved closer to the platform, and the orc leader dove into the open hatch, causing the machine to jerk in the air. Cantor roared in frustration, watching as the helicopter flew away on tongues of blue flame. Snagrod was about to flee. Suddenly, shots rang out behind him, and the shells clinked against the helicopter's armor. It cracked, but did not shatter. The orcs did not wait for a second volley. They turned the machine around and accelerated to maximum speed. Cantor followed them with his gaze and then furiously broke out again. Snagrod leaned out and met his gaze. Incredibly, the monster seemed to be laughing. Though the Chapter Master had won this duel, the Greenskins' assault had not weakened. When the ammunition ran out, they resorted to chainswords, combat knives, and their own fists. For 18 long months, they repelled the Greenskins' attacks, until in the year 990 of the 41st millennium, an enormous fleet of the Imperium arrived. The newcomers managed to drive the Xenos forces from the planet and liberate the world of Bryn. Although the Imperium officially declared the planet safe, several greenskin bands hid in the Jaden Mountains and periodically launched devastating raids on remote human settlements. Pedro Cantor personally attended to this problem, while the few surviving tech marines of the Crimson Fists salvaged and repaired the surviving equipment and gear. It was a difficult campaign because the Xenos defended every rock and cave, and Cantor lacked both men and equipment. With such a threat, the unification of the orcs somewhere in the mountains was only a matter of time, and it so happened that Traitor's Gorge became the site of a grand ambush on an Astartes squad. Their number was only 24, but Cantor and his Crimson Fists fought like heroes of legends against an orc horde of 100 greenskins. At the vanguard of the squad, Cantor fought his way out of the gorge onto higher ground, but the orcs continued to attack. 3 battle brothers were killed during the breakout from the gorge. In response, the Space Marines literally flooded the gorge with orc blood, fighting behind barricades built from Xenos bodies. Given that all Thunderhawk gunships were either lost in battle or undergoing repair, Cantor understood that evacuation or reinforcements were not to be expected. However, the Greenskins' assault began to wane. Orvac felt a wave of nausea. He fell, hitting his head painfully, and whether in a delirium or truly, he saw the visions of that battle seeping in thin streams from the scroll and taking shape somewhere on the edge of his consciousness. "Snipers!" shouted Cantor. "They're firing at the orcs from Widow's Spire and Dark Ridge." Cantor spotted them almost instantly. Agile, lithe figures armed with long-barreled rifles, swiftly darting from cover to cover and showering the advancing orcs with precise bursts of laser fire. Cantor immediately understood that these were not Crimson Fists. Given their supernatural grace and speed, the Master suspected they were not human at all. Cantor ran straight into the heart of the shattered orc horde. The air quivered with their ferocious cries as the Crimson Fists joined their master. The ground seemed to tremble with their fury. The unexpected counterattack completely broke the orcs. They fled down the slope, pelted by bolts of blinding light from the rifles of the unknown snipers. Their panic spread through the rest of the horde, and within minutes the entire mob of greenskins was rapidly fleeing towards the deserted camp. Cantor watched as one of his saviors separated from their comrades and with unnerving grace began to descend the steep rocky slope. The master was torn between feelings of relief and apprehension. Sophia traced a new blazing rune in the air and leapt from the cliff, gliding the last 10 meters and landing softly as if a leaf falling from a tree branch. She approached him without any formal greeting. Her witchblade pointed at the ground. "The surviving beasts have hidden below in the shadows, ensnared in our web," she said. "Hunt them in the darkness, and your victory will be complete." Despite the layers of heavy armor, the seer saw Cantor tense at her words. Like most human leaders, he was not accustomed to such manner of discourse. A ripple of unease passed through the ranks of Terminators, silently observing the conversation. Sophia gripped the shaft of her spear tighter, feeling the threads of fate stir at this moment. "And if I refuse?" the man eventually asked. Had the seer not worn a helmet, her jaw might have dropped in an unseemly display of shock. Such arrogance. She and her kin had crossed numerous star systems to save him. "Then they will escape, growing stronger in the darkness," she replied, as though speaking to a foolish child. "In 50 years, the shadow of your decision will grow and envelop this region of space. Unopposed, it will bring doom to both your people and mine. Catastrophe will become reality, and you will curse your inaction on this day." This seemed to capture Cantor's attention. The master turned for a moment to look over his warriors. "Will you assist us further as you did here?" "Do not be so quick to count us as allies," she snapped. She had said too much. Fortuitous fate had led to us fighting side by side this day. But the paths of destiny are fickle, and next time we meet, your blood will stain my hands. She turned on her heel and walked away, not giving Cantor a chance to respond, reflecting on how her outburst of emotion might have destroyed everything that had been so painstakingly built. Cantor weighed the words and actions carefully, and led his fighters into the Traitor's Pass. There, in the darkness, he indeed achieved a great victory, forever ending the orc threat in the mountains. Returning to the lowlands, he continued to restore the chapter and, over time, raised the Crimson Fists from the ruins to once again stand side by side with the greatest champions of humanity. Yet in all the subsequent years, the words of the elder woman would profoundly influence Cantor until they finally met again. Orvac's eyes rolled back, and his body was racked with convulsions. He let out a loud scream, then another and another. He could no longer stand and did not understand what was happening. His consciousness had completely shattered. Somewhere deep within a dark corridor, a shot rang out, and then the roar of a bolter shell's traveling engine barely matched the loudness of the man's scream. Time seemed to stand still. Propelled by trails of sparks, the bolt effortlessly passed through the membrane and defensive wall, its casing glimmering with brief flashes of light from psychic wards, smouldering sensors, and tiny bonfires. The projectile crossed the room and crashed noisily into the sideward on the opposite wall. The veil immediately collapsed, and a massive creature, wreathed in black smoke, entered the circle of the Temple of Knowledge. Approaching Orvac, it turned and fired a few bolter rounds into the unholy throngs that sought to enter the temple after it. Gaps immediately appeared in the ranks of the possessed, and they hastily retreated back into the darkness. The bolter's barrel hovered over Orvac's face, but instead of a shot, there was a click. The frustrated giant lifted his leg and forcefully brought his ceramite boot down on the face of the man writhing in agony. "Why did you kill him, Margus Shianok?" A whisper penetrated his mind. "He could have been useful to you." "The sleep of reason breeds monsters," Margus growled, and departed into the corridor to drag that twisted statue on chains. He understood that a demon was trapped within the petrified body and was whispering to him. However, the sorcerer was soon distracted by an energy-radiant parchment, approached the table where the man had been standing not long ago, and began to read. After the battle for the world of Rin, a disproportionate number of veterans and specialists remained in the ranks of the Crimson Fists, particularly tech marines and apothecaries. Without the apothecaries' knowledge of the complex process of creating new Astartes battle brothers, the chapter would have diminished and vanished within a short period. Moreover, they also collected gene seed, without which future losses could not be replenished. The Crimson Fists began recruiting not only from the world of Rin, but from the entire Loki sector. However, the process could not be hurried, as it was necessary to honor the ancient and noble tradition. Compromising on the quality and suitability of candidates at such a critical moment could one day lead to their demise. Although the recently reformed 10th Company consisted of several scout squads, they had already gained enough experience and developed a deep aversion to the greenskins. The surviving Tech Marines proved to be a valuable asset in the restoration of the chapter, as without their deep knowledge of the machine spirit's functioning, the Crimson Fists would have been unable to maintain the battle equipment in their arsenal and remain a viable fighting force. After the Orcs were driven out of Rin, a very interesting incident surfaced that would later become part of the chapter's history. When a malfunctioning missile from the Fortress Monastery's defensive system nearly annihilated the defenders, the Land Raider Rin's Might miraculously survived. The detonation awakened the machine spirit, and without a crew, it set out to carry out its last received command, to find and destroy. For several hours, Rin's Might extricated itself from the rubble and then set off in search of the enemy. After some time, it attacked the Orc vanguard. Las cannons and heavy bolters set trucks and buggies ablaze, turning them into burning coffins. Having destroyed about 30 Orc machines and dealt with fleeing crew members, Rin's Might continued the search. For 3 days, the tank prowled around the ruins of the burning fortress, dealing with encountered Orc patrols. At nightfall, the machine stumbled upon a Xeno camp. The greenskins were stunned by the sudden appearance of a lone assault tank, from which battle cries emanated from its loudspeakers. In the darkness, the artificial eyes and ears of the Land Raider functioned far better than those of the Orcs, and taking advantage of the confusion, it charged into battle with renewed determination. Rockets and energy projectiles scorched the machine's hull, but it never slowed down for a second, crushing bikes and Orcs under its heavy tracks, while the night was lit by flashes of volleys, las cannon blasts, bolter fire, and the burning remains of destroyed dreadnoughts and war buggies. The Orcs attempted to muster a counterattack, and the warlord gathered the bravest boys and knobs against the enraged lone machine. Noting the enemy's movement, Rin's Might surged towards the war leader directly, ignoring the projectiles that ricocheted off its thick armor. The bolters had exhausted their ammunition, the las cannons had melted from prolonged fire, and Rin's Might used its last remaining weapon, its own mass. Many Orcs panicked and fled at the sight of the oncoming embodiment of the machine god's wrath, its eyes shining like spotlights and chanting sacred binary litanies. The warlord maintained his composure and did not retreat, firing shell after shell at the advancing target with his crudely made gun, until a well-aimed shot tore through the tank's tread, causing the speeding vehicle to veer off course. The immobilized Land Raider could do nothing as the Orcs clambered onto its armor and began hammering it with bombs, ripping off entire chunks of ceramite and adamantium. But the Rin's Might prepared a final surprise. The vehicle opened all its hatches and lowered its assault ramp, and the loot-hungry greenskins poured inside. Once the Orcs were inside, the machine spirit sealed the exits again. The powerful hydraulics crushed careless Orcs in half and trapped the warlord and his retinue within. As a final act of retribution, Rin's Might overloaded its internal reactor, and streams of hot plasma and poisonous gases filled the interior of the tank, burning and suffocating the trapped Xenos. Later, the Magister found the remains of the Rin's Might and ordered them to be guarded, vowing to return and retrieve the machine spirit to give it a new body in which it could once again fight with all its fury and steadfastness. The Crimson Fists, like all of Dawn's descendants, are tenacious warriors who resort to maneuvers of retreat very reluctantly. Defeat for them is a bitter pill that the Battle Brothers had to swallow to learn the lessons from their failures on Rin. The thought that the chapter might vanish tempered their zeal and sobered their minds with grim reality, and henceforth they fought not only for honor and glory, but also for the survival of the chapter. "This is what a brother does," Shianok stated, "gathers intelligence on the enemies, no matter whose feats these are, but recorded by the hand of chaos they still glow in the Imperium, for even I see these lines." In the year 999 of the 33rd millennium, the Crimson Fists took part in the confrontation with the Tau in the Zeist sector. The fact of the matter is that by the year 997 of the 33rd millennium, the expansionist activity of the Tau had reached the edges of the imperial borders. Their activity was notable in that the Tau Empire sometimes resorted to the annexation of imperial planets through military force rather than the more common approach of cultural subversive activities. Imperial planetary governors on the eastern fringes of the galaxy called for massive reinforcements to repel the forces of the Tau, but due to the constant attacks by the Hive Fleet Leviathan and the increasing raids of Chaos renegades from the Maelstrom, few forces could respond to the call. However, one of the defenders of the Imperium who could do so was Marneus Calgar and his Space Marines. He dispatched the renowned Second Company of Ultramarines to the Zeiss sector to create a line of defense through which the Tau would not be able to pass. Calgar also sent requests for assistance to other chapters. When the Ultramarines arrived in the Zeiss sector, they found many abandoned worlds, while others were heavily fortified to defend against the lightning raids of the Tau. Captain Sicarius attacked the Forge world of Pretonis V to halt the ongoing Tau advance on this planet and used this momentum to push back the offensive. He utilized the same tactics as the Tau, which were ideal for the relatively smaller forces of the Space Marines, including rapid lightning strikes against weak positions to destabilize the more fortified areas. The Tau expansion slowed and then halted under the onslaught of the Imperium. Ultimately, only the world of Augura in the Zeiss sector remained in the hands of the Tau. Soon, the Ultramarines were no longer the only Space Marine forces involved in the assault. They were joined by the Crimson Fists and numerous other chapters. Despite the advanced technology of the Tau, they had no chance of defeating such a large force of the Adeptus Astartes. The fortresses of Augura, shipyards and weapon factories were either heavily damaged or destroyed by the Space Marines' offensive. With the loss of the last forward logistic base in the sector, the Tau retreated to defend safer territory within their own borders. Although the Space Marines had won the war and halted the capture of human territory, it was impossible to sanction a counterstrike into the Tau-held space, as the various Astartes forces were needed elsewhere in the galaxy to maintain the defense against the forces of Chaos amid the height of the 13th Black Crusade. Captain Sicarius reluctantly returned control of the defense of the Zeiss sector to its planetary governor. However, soon the Tau attacked again and seized the strategically important imperial world of Agrellan, just a few solar months after the conclusion of the Zeiss campaign. Agrellan was conquered and renamed Mugalath Bay. Near the end of the 41st millennium, in the era of omens preceding the emergence of the Great Rift, the Cornate Lord Tarquar the Terrible invaded the Leonot system at the head of his warband called the Bloodhounds. They broke through the Astra Militarum units defending the industrial world of Lerno IV and unleashed a bloody frenzy, turning trillions of workers into raging killers. Into this cauldron of ceaseless carnage, 30 Crimson Fists, led by the brilliant tactician Captain Julius and equipped with clear low-level parameters, were thrown. All of Julius's forces consisted of veteran brothers and tech marines who landed in the midst of the planet-wide madness and set their plans into motion. Using extermination teams to carry out a series of strikes on key targets, the Crimson Fists systematically destabilized the thermal macro-reactors that regulated the operation of the planet-sized tank manufactorum. Despite being constantly hunted by their Cornate enemies, the Space Marines fought only the battles that were necessary to ensure each strike hit its mark. 6 months later, 2/3 of the chapter's strike group engaged in the final furious battle and were evacuated on the strike cruiser Stormraven. This was followed by the triumphant howls of Tarquar and his chosen champions. However, their bravado was quickly cut short when the destabilized reactor detonated, triggering a devastating chain reaction that wiped out 86% of the planet's life. Only when the fiery storm subsided did the forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus land on the surface, easily finishing off the last remnants of the Chaos worshippers and claiming the subterranean riches of this world for themselves. However, After the appearance of the Great Rift, they had to return once again to their native system for its defense. History seemed doomed to repeat itself when the world of Rin suffered a demonic incursion during the warp storms that followed the birth of the Rift. The Crimson Fists were besieged on their homeworld by the overwhelmingly superior legions of Demon Prince Arcaxor. Pedro Cantor led the charge 3 times to push back the enemy. When the Indomitus Crusade arrived on Rin's world, Arcaxor's demonic legions were shattered. The Crimson Fists were astounded by the return of Raboot Guilliman, but they were even more grateful for the arrival of the Primaris Space Marines, bearing their own heraldry. These genetically engineered warriors were closer to the Primarch Rogel Dawn than any who had ever existed. As raw material, Belisarius Cawl had used warriors from Terra, who were only a few generations removed from the Imperial Fists created by the Emperor. Some of them had been in stasis since the time of the Great Crusade, and some even remembered Dawn in the flesh. After the battles for Rin's world, much work awaited Pedro Cantor. The demonic invasion had led to the devastation of most of the planet. The chapter was once again nearly destroyed. And with the reinforcements came entire companies of Crimson Fists who had never set foot on Rin's world and had no knowledge of the chapter's traditions and rituals. Thrilled by the Primarch of the Ultramarines, Pedro Cantor was simply too preoccupied to properly thank the Lord Commander of the Imperium for his timely arrival. Pressed for time, Guilliman stayed on Rin's world for only 3 days before his crusade departed. But before leaving, Guilliman summoned Pedro Cantor. The chapter master arrived, not even having time to clean his blood-stained and battle-marked power armor. Noticing the chapter master's unease, the Lord Commander of the Imperium reassured Cantor. He had summoned him not to reprimand him. Guilliman highly valued the chapter master's tenacity and resilience in the face of severe trials, as well as his unwavering dedication. The Primarch told Cantor that in the future he would need such men because humanity was confronted with darkness encircling it on all sides. He ordered him to restore the chapter and to look forward to the future, not to dwell on the past because the Imperium greatly needed him and his Crimson Fists. This speech inspired Cantor, and he resolutely set about restoring the Crimson Fists. And yet, the galaxy did not remain static. The war for the survival of humanity continued, and with the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the number of battlefields increased and the position of the Imperium became even more desperate. In the process of integrating the Primaris Marines into the ranks of the Crimson Fists perhaps earlier, he realized that the chapter was subject to a certain genetic curse that shaped the character of the Fists. It manifested in 3 stages. In the first stage, a warrior develops a reluctance to retreat before superior enemy forces, if there is even the slightest hope of victory. Even if the doctrine and teachings of the Codex Astartes prescribe a retreat or a flexible defense, a battle brother will not want to retreat until there is absolutely no choice left, although often this may occur too late. In the second stage, it becomes very difficult for the fighter to accept defeat, preferring to die fighting rather than admitting failure. This can lead to reckless behavior, where a soldier charges into an attack when prudence and tactical sense dictate a retreat. In the third stage, the battle brother comes to understand that only by sacrificing his own life can he ensure victory. This can have terrible consequences if circumstances present him with the opportunity to achieve martyrdom for the Emperor and bring death to the enemies. This means that he will fight despite injuries, continue attacking, or even appear on the front line, even if the next shot could be his end. He will also willingly accept missions, such as defusing unstable warheads, leading missions, or holding a breach to buy time for his comrades. The last campaign involving the Crimson Fists was the Battle for Vigilus in the 42nd millennium. Deciding to strengthen the bond between the novice and veteran, Pedro Cantor led a full 5 companies to fight in the Nakmund Gauntlet, the corridor that connects human dominions with the Imperium Nihilus. The Crimson Fists were once again full of strength and ready to fight not only for their home world, but also for distant worlds without which the Imperium as a whole could not manage. Landing on the surface of the world of St. Hayden, the Crimson Fists did not immediately rush into battle, as many of their brethren did. Instead, Pedro Cantor appeared before the ruling Senate of Vigilus, which had been created by Marneus Calgar, and consulted with the military leaders of the assembly, including Calgar himself. Cantor was there to serve, not to seek glory. In this way, he wished to repay the trust placed in him by Robert Gilliman. To the great disappointment of the Crimson Fists, detachments from the world of Rin were not sent to fight the Orcs of Vigilus. Instead, they received orders to assist the resistance in Hive Dirkton. Their task was to slow down the Djinsteel cultists who had erupted from the lower levels of Dirkton in such incredible numbers that many immediately deemed the city lost. Cantor hurried to the fortress wall of Hyperia Dirkton and was attacked by elements of the cult known as the Prince of Beggars. At the wall, he crossed into the war-torn hellscape of the Riscolithic subterranean structures. His noble troops, without pause, fought pure-strain Djinsteelers, cleansing the nests of vile creatures with flame and continuous volleys of bolter fire. Their goal was not mere destruction. They fought in a complex, overlapping web of battles designed to buy time for the untainted citizens of the Imperium. The population of Dirkton had plunged into a nightmare where every building, dwelling, or bunker could hide twisted xenomutants. The Crimson Fists worked side by side with Cadian forces, saving tens of thousands of lives. Soon, columns of refugees streamed into the dusty southern hive sectors of Hyperia, where the Order of the Copper Talons had recently repelled the Orc invaders. When it was decreed by the Adeptus Ministorum that Hyperia's resources were exhausted and they could no longer take in more unfortunate souls, and that agents of the Prince of Beggars had also escaped Dirkton disguised as refugees, Pedro Cantor advocated for a strict screening procedure at the southern gates of the fortress wall. He did this with such passion and eloquence that the Ministorum agreed to a compromise and implemented the requested checkpoints, managed by veterans of the Cardian regiments. In the end, even this was insufficient. The fourth wall and Dirkton eventually fell to the onslaught of the Djinsteelers cults, but without the efficiency, conviction, and compassion of the Crimson Fists. The Hive would have fallen long before the climax of the War of the Beast, condemning millions more innocent souls to death. "A strong order and a worthy adversary," Shianok whispered approvingly. "They seem to refuse to die and rise from the ashes every time. Their zeal for life is commendable, as is their fanatical devotion to the corpse on the throne. If my legion had faced such an enemy, our battle would have sated the Pantheon to the utmost."